The heartbeat of Thessaloniki is not in its grand squares, but in its labyrinthine veins. The ancient port city thrums with a rhythm set by thousands of feet moving through the Modiano market. The air is a thick tapestry of scents: brine from the harbor, charcoal smoke from roasting chestnuts, the sharp perfume of oregano and cumin from open sacks, and the faint, ever-present smell of old paper and ink from the bookstalls. This is not a city that simply exists. It sings. And its song is in Ladino, the medieval Spanish of the exiled, now woven with Greek, Turkish, and Slavic threads into something uniquely, fiercely Salonican. We move with Isaac Cohen, not as an observer, but as a man moving through his kingdom. His hand brushes over bolts of silk and wool in his textile warehouse, his fingers reading the quality like Braille. This is his legacy, built by his father, on trust and the complex calculus of family and community. He is a pillar. But today, the pillar feels a tremor. As he locks the warehouse shutters, his eyes catch the front page of a discarded Athenian newspaper, curled in a damp gutter. A blurry photograph of a crowd, a raised arm, a strange flag. He kicks the paper into a drain with a sudden, sharp motion he doesn't fully understand. His walk home is a journey through a living archive. He passes the neighborhood of Rezi Vardar, where the shouts from a tavern are in Ladino. He nods to Rabbi Koretz, a man burdened with the weight of a community, whose smile doesn't reach his eyes. He sees his eldest son, David, not at the family warehouse, but outside a university building, deep in heated conversation with Greek classmates. David's hands cut the air, arguing about democracy, modernity, the future, a future he believes is his by right as a Greek. Isaac feels a pang of pride mixed with a deep, unspoken fear. His son's world is one of ideas. Isaac's is one of walls, goods, and tangible threats. Home is an apartment above a narrow street, its walls holding the echoes of 4 centuries of settlement. It is not quiet. It is alive with the friction of love. His wife, Esther, is the family's unshakable core. She is not just preparing dinner. She is conducting an orchestra of scents: sizzling eggplant, lemon, garlic. Her strength is in her hands, moving with a precise, calm energy. But Isaac sees the tiny crack, the way her knife hesitates for a fraction of a second, when a military truck rumbles past outside, a sound that has become more frequent, more intrusive. Their daughter, Leah, fills the space with music. She practices a Sephardic romance on the piano. Quando el Rey Nimrod, its mournful, ancient melody clashing with a modern, upbeat Greek tune she tries to blend in, her fingers stumbling between 2 worlds. She is stitching a new dress from fabric her father gave her, dreaming of a dance she hopes will come. Their youngest, Samuel, 10 years old, and a creature of pure, untamed curiosity, is under the table, lining up his lead soldiers. Not Greek Evzones, but a mismatched set. A Greek hoplite, a Roman legionnaire, a Byzantine guard. He is refighting the city's long history on the parquet floor, oblivious to the one bearing down on him. The family dinner is not a portrait of peace. It is a battlefield of affections and tensions. David speaks of laws, of Europe, of a world beyond the port. Isaac counters with the practical, the shipments, the creditors, the solidity of what is. Leah tries to bridge the gap with a story from school, but her voice is drowned by the debate. Esther's eyes meet Isaac's across the table, a silent telegram of concern, of a shared, unnamed dread that they dare not voice in front of the children. The food, rich and flavorful, tastes faintly of anxiety. Later, under the pretext of checking the warehouse, Isaac climbs to the flat roof. From here, Thessaloniki is a sea of terracotta roofs and minarets, synagogue domes and church spires, all silhouetted against the indigo night and the darker expanse of the sea. This is his universe. He lights a cigarette, the flare of the match illuminating the deep lines on his face. His gaze sweeps the city, loving it, then inevitably is drawn to the port. The usual constellation of merchant ship lights is there, but among them a new shape, darker, sharper, more angular, a ship with lines meant not for trade but for utility, a German cargo vessel. It arrived yesterday quietly. A memory, unbidden and brutal, slices through him. Not a thought, but a sensory flash. The feel of that damp newspaper under his shoe, the grainy photo of a smashed shop window in some distant German city. The sound of his own heart, loud in his ears. He takes a sharp drag, forcing the image away. This is Thessaloniki, he tells himself. We are Greeks. We are Ottomans. We are Romans. We survive. We endure. Downstairs, through the open window, he hears Leah resume her piano practice, the two melodies, the ancient Ladino and the modern Greek, now clashing discordantly, neither winning. Samuel is laughing at something, Esther calls out, her voice warm but edged with exhaustion. Isaac looks back at the dark ship. A single cold pinprick of light winks from its deck, like an unblinking eye, watching the sleeping city. He stubs out the cigarette, grinding it violently against the parapet. The tremor he felt earlier is now a silent, persistent vibration in his bones. He turns his back on the port and goes inside, closing the French doors firmly behind him, as if he could shut out the view. But the image of that ship, a silent metallic predator anchored in the heart of their world, is now etched into the retina of the audience. The heartbeat of the city continues, but a new arrhythmic pulse has joined it, the slow, patient beat of a coming end. The mosaic is still beautiful, but the first tile has just come loose. The invasion did not arrive with thunder, but with a sinister bureaucratic whisper. It was not the roar of Stukas over Thessaloniki, but the methodical, crisp click of leather heels on the ancient cobblestones of Aristoteles Square. Spring, 1941. The air, which should have smelled of blooming orange trees and salt, carried a new scent. Diesel exhaust from German military vehicles and the unfamiliar acrid odor of cheap foreign tobacco. The change was incremental, a slow tightening of a noose disguised as administrative procedure. First, it was the posters. They appeared overnight, pasted on kiosks and the walls of government buildings, proclamations in Greek and German, bearing the angular, aggressive eagle and swastika. The text spoke of order, cooperation, and the new era. The Greek flags that had flown with such pride were gone, replaced by these alien banners that hung limp in the sea breeze, their shadows like bruises on the sun-bleached walls. For Isaac Cohen, the abstract fear on the rooftop crystallized into a daily, gnawing reality. His warehouse, once a hub of bustling commerce, grew quiet. Greek customers, faces pale with their own humiliation and fear, began to avoid his eye. Some still came, but their transactions were swift, hushed, accompanied by apologetic glances over their shoulders. Then came the official from the newly established Kriegsverwaltung, the German military administration. He was not a soldier with a rifle, but a civilian in a suit, flanked by a Greek interpreter whose voice trembled. The man had a clipboard. He asked precise, polite questions about inventory, turnover, assets. He took notes without looking up. His fingers, pale and meticulous, traced the columns of Isaac's ledgers, a ledger that contained the entire story of his family's labor. The man left with a copy. No seizure, not yet. Just an audit. The violation was in the calm, entitled scrutiny, in the understanding that everything Isaac had built was now someone else's data point. The city's soundscape warped. The dominant melody of Ladino and Greek was now underscored by the guttural rhythm of German commands, the stomping of booted patrols, the constant radio static from military jeeps. Cafes Isaac had frequented for decades now had signs he could not read, but whose meaning was clear. Nur for Wehrmacht. The public spaces were shrinking, redefined by invisible walls. Within the Cohen household, the fragile dinner table debates shattered. David's intellectual arguments about citizenship and progress turned to ash in his mouth. His Greek friends from university vanished. The future he had mapped out was erased overnight. Now his anger was hot, directionless, dangerous. He wanted to burn something, to fight, but there was no enemy to punch, only a suffocating, formless pressure. He watched his father, who seemed to be shrinking, bargaining with phantoms, and felt a corrosive mix of pity and rage. Leah's world of music and dreams was invaded. The modern Greek tunes she loved were now forbidden on the radio, replaced by martial German marches. Her piano fell silent. The dress she was sewing remained unfinished on her mannequin, a ghost of a postponed life. Her vulnerability was no longer abstract. It was a physical sensation when the gaze of a German soldier lingered on her too long in the street. A gaze that was not flirtatious, but appraising, dehumanizing. She took to looking at the floor, folding into herself. Little Samuel's soldier game changed. He added new gray-painted figures a classmate had traded him, German soldiers. He made them fight his Greek hoplites. But in his game, the Germans always won, not through heroism, but through a cold, mechanical advance that pushed his other soldiers off the edge of the table. His play had become a grim, subconscious rehearsal. Esther, the family's anchor, fought her war in the domestic sphere. Food became scarcer, the market stalls emptier, the prices impossible. Her bargaining prowess was useless against ration cards they did not have. Her genius was now directed at stretching a handful of lentils, at concealing the fear in her eyes when Isaac came home with another piece of bad news. She saw the cracks in her family, Isaac's quiet despair, David's volatile fury, Leah's retreat, Samuel's confused mimicry of violence, and she plastered over them with forced routine, with an extra spoon of soup, with a touch on the shoulder. But her hands, which had always been steady, now had a faint, constant tremor. The climax of this chapter of quiet suffocation came not with a bang, but with a piece of paper. A new decree, read aloud in the streets by a Greek policeman who could not meet the eyes of his neighbors. All Jewish males aged 18 to 45 were to report to Liberty Square for registration and community service. It was a polite term. They all felt its true weight. The morning of the registration, Isaac put on his best suit, a ridiculous, tragic act of dignity. David, seething, did the same. Esther adjusted Isaac's tie, her fingers lingering on his cheek. A silent, desperate communication. They walked out together, father and son, not to the warehouse, but to the vast square now dominated by German administrative tents and armed guards. The scene was a masterpiece of controlled dehumanization. Lines of men, hundreds of them, friends, rivals, scholars, porters, all reduced to a queue. They were processed like livestock, names checked off lists, documents examined, questions barked. Isaac stood straight, his face a mask of stoic cooperation, while inside his soul screamed at the indignity. David's youthful defiance drained from his face, replaced by a chilling understanding of powerlessness. He saw a German officer casually flick ash from his cigarette onto the shoulder of an elderly man in front of them. The man didn't dare brush it off. They were not beaten. They were not arrested. They were given cards, Kinderkarten, with their personal details and a large, stamped letter J. They were dismissed. As they walked home, the card burning in Isaac's pocket, the city looked the same. The sun still shone on the white buildings, but nothing was the same. They had been counted, catalogued, and marked. The first, irreversible step had been taken. The noose was no longer being slowly tightened. It had been placed around the neck of an entire people, and they had been made to adjust the knot themselves. The shadow of the ship in the port had stepped ashore, and it was walking among them, wearing a suit and carrying a clipboard. The yellow star did not arrive as a single decree, but as the final, devastating stroke in a campaign of meticulous civic erasure. It began with the confiscation of the radios. A squad of Greek policemen, their faces etched with a shame so deep it looked like nausea, moved door to door in the Jewish quarter. They were efficient, silent. In the Cohen apartment, the large Philips radio, the source of Leah's music, the family's connection to a world beyond their walls, was unplugged and carried out. The space on the sideboard it left behind was a void, a silent scream. Now, the only news was rumor, whispered in queues for water or bread, growing more monstrous with each retelling. Then came the systematic plunder, dressed in the sterile language of law. A notice arrived for Isaac. His textile warehouse and all its contents were deemed enemy property under a new ordinance. He was to surrender the keys to the Economic Administration, a department run by a bespectacled German bureaucrat named Dr. Merton, who spoke of safeguarding assets and maintaining order. The day Isaac handed over the keys, he did not go alone. He took David, forcing him to witness. The German clerk barely looked up, stamping a form with a final metallic thud that echoed in the empty office. The building wasn't burned, it was transferred. The inventory Isaac's father had painstakingly built became a line item on a German ledger. As they left, Isaac saw a Greek competitor, a man he had known for 30 years, already inside speaking animatedly with the clerk. The betrayal was not violent. It was commercial, administrative, and it tasted of dust and bile. The family's financial veins were severed one by one, bank accounts frozen, telephones disconnected, the last lifeline to cousins in Athens, to the wider world, gone with the snip of a wire. They were being pushed back, century by century, into a state of medieval dependence. Esther sold jewelry in back alleys to Greek pawnbrokers, who offered a tenth of its value, their greed momentarily overpowering their fear. Each piece exchanged for a few drachmas was a tiny amputation of their past. And then, the stars. They were not provided. The decree stated they must be purchased from designated stores and sewn securely onto the outer garment. 6 points of fabric, canary yellow, with the word Jude in a faux Hebrew script at its center, a cruel mockery of their own identity, turned into a brand. The scene in the Cohen household was one of silent, domestic horror. Esther, the seamstress of the family, had to perform the act. She sat by the weak light of the window, a pile of the coarse yellow badges beside her. Isaac stood before her, wearing his good overcoat. Her needle, usually so swift and sure, hovered. Her hand shook. To pierce the fabric of his coat was to pierce his dignity, to make the invisible hate visible. She pricked her own finger, a tiny bead of blood blooming against the yellow cloth. She did not gasp. She simply stared at it, this bizarre mingling of her blood and the imposed symbol. Then, with a grimace of pure will, she began to sew, each stitch a small act of violation. She did it for Isaac's coat, for David's jacket, for her own cardigan, for Leah's favorite spring coat. She saved Samuel's small star for last. When she finished, she bit the thread with her teeth, the gesture shockingly fierce, final. The first time they walked outside marked, the city transformed into a gauntlet. It was as if the star emitted a silent, repellent force field. Greek neighbors they had known for lifetimes averted their eyes completely, crossing the street to avoid the contagion of their presence. Some looked with pity. A rare, dangerous few offered a barely perceptible nod. But the majority simply saw the star, not the person. Isaac, the pillar, felt his body trying to fold in on itself, to become smaller, to hide the glaring badge. David walked with his chin raised defiantly, the star like a target on his chest, inviting a challenge that could get him killed. Leah wrapped a shawl over her coat, a pathetic, transparent attempt at camouflage that lasted only until a German patrol officer sharply gestured for her to remove it. The public humiliation was ritualized. Signs bloomed everywhere, sprouting like toxic fungi. Juden verboten, forbidden from parks, from cafes, from trams, from barber shops, from public benches. The city, their city, was being digitally carved away from them. Samuel, confused, tried to sit on his favorite bench by the sea. A Greek policeman, not unkindly but firmly, tapped his nightstick against the new sign. The boy looked at his mother, his understanding dawning not through law but through the loss of a simple childhood pleasure. His world was now a maze of prohibitions. The isolation became physical, sensory. They were ghosts in their own hometown, visible only as floating yellow asterisks. Conversations in the street died as they approached. The vibrant soundscape of Ladino was now hushed, hurried, spoken behind closed doors. The community was being quarantined alive. The chapter's crushing end came with a new, perversely logical decree. A curfew. All Jews must be indoors from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. The setting sun, once a symbol of rest, became a warden locking their cell. That first night of curfew, the Cohen family sat in their living room as dusk fell. They did not turn on the lights, sitting in the thickening blue gloom. From the street below came the sounds of life continuing. Greek families taking their evening volta, the clatter of a tram, laughter from a cafe they could no longer enter. They were listeners at the keyhole of existence. The apartment walls, once a sanctuary, were now the boundaries of a prison. The yellow star on David's jacket, hanging on a peg by the door, seemed to glow in the half-light, a poisonous, six-pointed ember in the darkness. The noose was no longer just tight, it was cutting off the air. Every breath was now measured, rationed, and taken under the watchful eye of a symbol they had been forced to stitch onto their own skin. The violence, when it finally shed its bureaucratic skin, arrived not as a chaotic riot, but as a calculated spectacle. It began with the forced labor conscription, a new list posted in the ghettoized quarter. David Cohen's name was on it. This was not the community service of before. This was slavery. Every morning at dawn, squads of men were marched under guard to the port, to railway yards, to German construction sites. Their task, to dismantle. Isaac watched from a distance, hidden in a doorway, as his son and hundreds of others were handed sledgehammers, pickaxes, and crowbars. Their assignment was the demolition of the vast, ancient Jewish cemetery, a city of the dead that had grown for 5 centuries on the eastern slopes of the Salonika. Tombstones dating from the Spanish arrival to the Ottoman zenith, marble and granite carved with Ladino elegies, the physical memory of the community. They were ordered to break them, to pulverize them for use as construction aggregate, for paving roads, for filling the foundations of German fortifications. The scene was a masterpiece of sadistic symbolism. David, his hands raw and bleeding within hours, was made to swing a sledgehammer against the tombstone of a 16th century rabbi, a scholar his own father had quoted at the dinner table. The sound was not of breaking stone, but of breaking history. Dust, white and ghostly, coated the men, making them look like specters destroying their own ancestry. German engineers supervised, pointing with cold efficiency, ensuring the marble blocks were of usable size. Some soldiers took photographs, smiling. The brutality was not in beatings, though those happened for those who worked too slowly, but in the absolute violation of meaning. David's youthful defiance finally shattered under the weight of the sledgehammer. Each impact broke something inside him, turning rage into a hollow, grinding despair. He was erasing his own roots with his own hands. Meanwhile, the net of public terror was cast wider. Roundups for interrogation became random, arbitrary. One evening, German SS officers from the newly arrived Sonderkommando, under the cool, precise Hauptsturmführer Alois Brunner, flanked by Greek paramilitary police, stormed into apartment buildings. They were looking for community leaders, intellectuals, anyone with potential for organizing resistance. They took Isaac's neighbor, the gentle, bookish Professor Levi, a historian of the Sephardic world. They did not drag him screaming. They requested he come with them for clarification. His wife's silent, wide-eyed terror, as he was led away, clutching only his hat, was more chilling than any riot. He did not return. His absence was a cold void in the building, a warning written in negative space. The psychological warfare was diabolical. Rumors, seeded deliberately by the authorities, slithered through the queues for the dwindling water rations. There were camps in the east for resettlement. They were needed for labor. Families would be kept together. It was a perverse glimmer of hope, a life raft made of lies that the drowning community clung to. Some began to whisper that perhaps deportation was preferable to this slow death. Better the unknown than the daily crucifixion. Inside the Cohen apartment, the family unit strained and cracked under the pressure. David returned each night from the cemetery, his body caked in the dust of his ancestors, silent and vacant. He would scrub his hands raw at the sink, unable to wash away the feeling of sacrilege. The star on his jacket was now the least of his marks. Isaac, stripped of his role as provider and protector, retreated into a silent, impotent fury. He spent hours staring at a single hidden photograph of his father in front of the warehouse, his jaw clenched so tight it seemed his teeth might powder. Leah witnessed an act that severed her last connection to innocence. From the window, she saw two German soldiers stop an elderly Romaniot woman, a fixture of the neighborhood who sold herbs. They accused her of violating curfew, though it was still daylight. One soldier, laughing, took the basket of dried mint and oregano from her hands and poured it onto the cobblestones. Then he forced her to kneel and pick each sprig up, one by one, while his comrade stood over her. The humiliation was casual, sportive. Leah watched the old woman's trembling hands, the tears cutting paths through the dust on her cheeks. She did not look away. When she finally turned from the window, her face was set in a new, hard mask. The dreams of music and dances were gone, burned away by the acid of shame she had been forced to ingest. Samuel, absorbing the fear like a toxin, stopped playing with soldiers altogether. He began hiding small things, a crust of bread, a button, a pebble, in a hole in the wall behind his bed, a tiny, instinctual hoard against an ending he couldn't name. The chapter's climax was not an action, but a sound and a sight. One afternoon, a deep mechanical grinding echoed through the quarter, a sound that had underlaid their days for weeks. Isaac followed it, moving like a shadow through back alleys until he reached a vantage point. He saw a German engineering vehicle, a massive industrial rock crusher, now operational at the cemetery site. It was being fed the larger, intricately carved tombstones his son and the others had pried from the earth. The machine roared, a hungry, mechanical beast. From its mouth spewed a continuous, uniform gravel, a gray, anonymous stream that was loaded onto carts. The beautiful, unique script, the family names, the dates spanning continents and epochs were being ground into dust to pave roads for the vehicles of their destroyers. Isaac stood there, motionless. The last vestige of hope, the stubborn belief in the endurance of memory, of legacy, died in his chest. They were not just being killed, they were being unmade, erased from the future, and now, systematically, from the past. The community's soul was being fed into the crusher, and the indifferent, deafening roar of the machine was the only elegy that remained. The breaking point had been reached, not with a scream, but with the sound of stone becoming nothing. The final stripping away of their humanity was presented as a grim logistical necessity. The order for resettlement came not as a shouted threat, but as a densely worded proclamation plastered on walls already scarred by previous decrees. All Jews of Thessaloniki were to be concentrated in a designated district adjacent to the railway lines, the quarter of Baron Hirsch, to facilitate the orderly process of labor transfer to the east. The language was sterile, administrative, masking a monstrous intent. The move was not a migration. It was a controlled implosion. They were given 48 hours to pack a single suitcase per person, no more than 50 kilograms. The ensuing scenes in the Cohen apartment were a frenzied, heartbreaking triage of an entire life. What do you take when you are told you are being relocated for work? Isaac, the pragmatist, insisted on practical items: wool blankets, sturdy shoes, cooking pots. Esther, the guardian of their soul, fought silently, her hands hovering over photo albums, over the silver Shabbat candlesticks her mother had carried from Istanbul, over Leah's sheet music. Each object she touched was a world of memory. In the end, she hid a tiny, framed portrait of her parents inside a rolled-up blanket, a secret act of defiance against the 50-kilogram limit on existence. David, moving with a new, frightening detachment, packed nothing but a change of clothes and his father's hidden ledger, the only remaining proof of what they had once been. Leah chose her unfinished dress, a threadbare symbol of a future she no longer believed in, but couldn't abandon. Samuel, imitating his mother, tried to stuff his entire box of hidden treasures into his small case, his face crumpling in confusion when it wouldn't fit. The march to Baron Hirsch was a funeral procession for the living. Families dragged their suitcases through streets now lined with a silent, shame-faced audience of their Greek neighbors. Some shutters were closed. Some faces watched from behind lace curtains, pale and ghostly. A few, at tremendous risk, left cups of water on doorsteps, a gesture so small and so vast it was almost unbearable. The Cohen family walked past their own warehouse, now bearing a new Greek sign. They walked past cafes they would never enter again. With every step, they shed another layer of their identity until only the suitcase and the yellow star remained. The Baron Hirsch Quarter was not a place meant for life. It was a pen. A cramped, squalid grid of low, condemned housing and empty warehouses bordering the marshalling yards of the railway. The air, once perfumed by the sea, was now thick with the stench of backed-up sewers, coal smoke, and the dense, sour odor of too many bodies pressed into too little space. They were assigned a single room for all 5 of them. Their neighbors were a wall away, every cough, every sob, every whispered prayer audible. Privacy, the last refuge of the individual, was annihilated. Here, the Jewish Council, the Judenrat, established by German order, became the tragic, visible face of the torment. Men like Rabbi Koretz, their shoulders permanently bowed under an impossible weight, moved through the squalor, distributing watery soup, transmitting orders, trying to maintain a shred of order. They were viewed with a complex, corrosive mix of dependence, pity, and hatred. They were the buffer, the translators of the unspeakable, forced to make unthinkable choices about who would be on which list, who would receive which scrap of medicine. Isaac saw the rabbi in the muddy lane, his eyes those of a man already in hell, and felt his last ember of anger sputter out, replaced by a cold, universal pity. The Germans, now embodied by the chillingly efficient SS Hauptsturmführer Alois Brunner and his men, rarely entered the ghetto itself. They operated from the periphery, from clean offices. Their will was imposed through the Judenrat, through loudspeaker announcements, through the sudden, terrifying appearances of the Greek police auxiliaries, to drag someone away for questioning. The terror was bureaucratized, outsourced, making it even more disorienting. Within the single room, the family dynamics mutated in the pressure cooker. David, his spirit broken by the cemetery, now fixated on the rumors of work camps. He argued with a desperate, hollow logic. Perhaps it was better. Perhaps there would be food, order, a chance to be useful. His was the tragedy of a mind seeking reason in the heart of madness, clinging to the official lie because the truth was too terminal to contemplate. Isaac, watching him, saw not his rebellious son, but a man trying to negotiate with the executioner for a sharper axe. Leah witnessed the systematic disintegration of modesty and dignity around her. She saw women washing themselves in full view with a cupful of rationed water, saw the slow evaporation of social norms under the pressure of sheer survival. She retreated further inward, her eyes taking on a distant, glassy quality, as if she were viewing their reality from a very far, very safe place. The climax of the chapter was the night of the first selection within the ghetto. It was not for deportation, but for a work detail. Brunner's men, via the Judenrat, demanded 200 able-bodied men. The lists were compiled from the registration cards. The chosen were to assemble at dawn. David's name again was on it. The night before his departure, the family huddled in their dark room. No words were adequate. Esther mended a tear in his shirt by the light of a single, forbidden candle. Her stitches impossibly small and perfect, as if she could sew him a shield. Isaac placed his own father's pocket watch into David's hand. A final transfer of legacy to a vanishing future. Samuel, in a moment of heartbreaking clarity, gave David his favorite lead soldier, the Greek hoplite. For protection, he whispered. At dawn, David joined the shuffling line of men in the muddy yard. They were counted, checked off, and marched out through the barbed wire perimeter, not towards the city, but deeper into the rail yards. The family watched from the window of their room, their faces pressed against the cold glass. They did not see him board a train. They saw him disappear behind a row of freight cars. His absence in the cramped room was suddenly colossal, a void that swallowed all remaining sound and warmth. He was gone, and with him, the last pretense that this was about anything other than disassembly. They were no longer being persecuted in their city. They were inventory in a warehouse, and the first items had just been shipped out. The ghetto was not a waiting room. It was the loading bay. A new electric terror crackled through the barren Hirsch quarter, severing the last fragile threads of hope. It was a terror born of definitive knowledge. Whispers, no longer of labor camps, but of a place called Auschwitz, carried by a desperate Greek railway worker who had spoken to a half-dead man clinging to the undercarriage of a returning train. The words gas, chimneys, selection seeped into the collective consciousness like a psychic poison. The lie was dead. The monstrous truth now sat among them, a silent, suffocating presence in every cramped room. The German machinery shifted from preparation to execution with chilling precision. The final decree was delivered not by poster, but by the tinny, distorted voice through the loudspeakers. All remaining inhabitants of the quarter were to prepare for immediate evacuation to new homes in the east. They were to assemble in the central yard at dawn with their luggage. This was not a call for a work detail. This was totality. The Cohen's room, now holding only Isaac, Esther, Leah, and Samuel, became a stage for the final private unraveling. The reality of the rumors stripped away all pretense. Esther did not pack. Instead, she moved with a serene, terrifying purpose. She took the hidden family photograph from the blanket and placed it in the center of the small table. She lit the last of their Sabbath candles, a tiny defiant flame in the pre-dawn gloom, violating every order. This was not for light. It was a ritual, a final marker of who they were. She then methodically prepared a meager meal from their last scraps, some hard bread, a spoonful of conserve. She laid out 4 places. It was a last supper, a sacrament of memory. Isaac watched her, his own practical spirit finally extinguished. He did not protest the wasted food or the dangerous candle. He saw in her actions the only form of resistance left, to meet the end as themselves. He took his father's ledger, the one David had taken and that had been returned when his son was sent back from the work detail a week later, broken and feverish. Isaac didn't open it. He simply held its weight. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, he ripped out the pages, one by one, the sound of tearing paper, shockingly loud. He stuffed them into the small, inefficient stove. He burned the proof of their commercial life, watching the numbers and names that had defined him curl into black ash. He would not let them archive his soul. Leah, in the corner, faced her own annihilation. She held the unfinished dress. She had no needle, no thread. She looked at it for a long moment, at the hopeful fabric now a relic of a dead world. Then, with a calm that was more devastating than any scream, she began to methodically unpick the seams with her fingernails. She unraveled the dress stitch by stitch, reducing it to a pile of disconnected cloth and thread. She was deconstructing her own future, ensuring no one else would wear it, that it would cease to exist as a garment, just as she was about to cease to exist as a person. Samuel, sensing the cataclysmic shift in the adults, did not cry. He retrieved his hidden hoard from the wall, the crust, the button, the pebble. He clutched them in his fist. Then he went to his mother and pressed them into her hand, a final futile offering of his prepared treasures. For the journey he now understood was not a journey. Dawn approached, a gray, colorless smear in the sky. From outside came the sounds of the final machinery falling into place, the revving of truck engines, the shouted commands in German, the barking of dogs, the first collective wails from elsewhere in the compound. The door to their room was still closed. This was their last moments of sovereign space. Esther finished her ritual. She blew out the Sabbath candle. The smoke ribboned upwards, the smell of extinguished wax mixing with the smell of fear and coal dust. She looked at her family, her gaze lingering on each face, memorizing them not as they were now, haggard, terrified, but as they had been. Isaac in his warehouse, David arguing at the table, Leah at the piano, Samuel playing on the floor. She held that image in her eyes. Then came the pounding on the door. Not the polite, dreadful knock of the Judenrat, but the hard, percussive bang of a rifle butt. A voice barked in German, then Greek. Out! Now! Schnell! The sound was a guillotine blade dropping on the silence. It severed the last moment of being a family in a room. They were now units to be processed. Isaac stood, his legs unsteady. Esther smoothed her dress, a gesture of absurd, magnificent dignity. Leah let the pile of unraveled cloth fall to the floor. Samuel took his mother's hand. Isaac opened the door. The scene outside was a vision of hell organized with Teutonic efficiency. The yard was a sea of shuffling, weeping humanity, pressed into rows by Greek policemen with clubs and German SS with machine pistols. The air was thick with panic, with the cries of separated families, the sharp commands. They were swallowed by the crowd immediately, their individuality subsumed into a terrified, flowing mass. They were funneled towards a series of tables where clerks, under the watchful eyes of SS officers, made final checks against master lists. This was the last administrative act, the final tick of the box. As they were pushed forward, Isaac saw, across the crowd, David. His son was being held upright by two other men, his face gray, his eyes unfocused, a victim of the fever and despair that had consumed him since his return. Their eyes met for a second across the chaos. A final silent communication of utter loss. Then the current of bodies pulled them apart forever. The Cohens reached the table. A clerk, not looking up, found their names on his list. He drew a thick black line through them. The sound of the pen was the loudest sound Isaac had ever heard. It was the period at the end of their story. They were accounted for. They were now cargo. The door to their past was not just closed. It had been sealed shut with official ink, and they stood on the wrong side of it, in the cold, roaring present of the Baron Hirsch yard. The chaos of Baron Hirsch funneled into a brutal, linear order. The shouting, the dogs, the crushing press of bodies were all directed toward a single point. The train tracks. The Cohens, swept along in the human current, lost all control over their movement. Isaac held on to Samuel with a grip that threatened to crush the small bones in the boy's hand. Esther clung to Leah, her arm a rigid bar against the tide, threatening to separate them. They were no longer walking. They were being pumped through the veins of a machine toward its heart. The sight that opened before them as they were pushed out of the ghetto's perimeter and into the wider marshalling yard was one of chilling industrial scale. The March air was cold, but it was thicker, heavier here, saturated with coal smoke and the metallic scent of grease and fear. And there they stood. A long, seemingly endless line of freight cars, their dark, weathered wood and rusted iron fittings looking ancient and malevolent. These were not passenger carriages. They were Güterwagen, cattle cars. Each one had a sliding door, now open, revealing a dark, cavernous interior. Beside each door stood a Greek guard or a policeman, their faces set in masks of either blank duty or grim participation, and a German SS officer, immaculate and watchful, a clipboard in hand. The process was a study in dehumanizing efficiency. At the head of the line leading to each car, a final, violent frisking occurred. Suitcases were ripped from hands, pried open, and upended. Possessions deemed unnecessary, photographs, books, toys, extra clothing, were tossed into a growing mountain of discarded life that littered the gravel between the tracks. Isaac watched as a soldier flung Esther's hidden photograph into the pile. The glass shattered with a tiny, insignificant crack. Their last 50 kilograms of existence were rendered meaningless in an instant. Samuel's small case was kicked open, his spare shirt and the soldier David had given him spilling onto the dirt. A guard stepped on the toy, crushing the lead hoplite under his boot with a casual twist of his heel. Then came the loading. It was not boarding. It was packing. People were driven toward the open doors with shouts and the occasional crack of a truncheon. There was no ramp. The floor of the car was chest high. The young and strong were forced to climb in first, then pull up the old, the sick, the children. Isaac boosted Samuel up into the darkness, where unknown hands grabbed the boy and dragged him inside. He then helped Esther, feeling her lightness, her frailty, as he practically lifted her into the void. Leah followed, her movements robotic. Isaac was the last. He turned for one final, sweeping look. Behind him was the chaos of the selection, the mountain of scattered belongings, the pale, terrified river of people still flowing from the ghetto. Ahead was the black mouth of the car. Above it all, watching from a raised platform with detached interest, stood Hauptsturmführer Brunner, smoking a cigarette, occasionally nodding to an aide. Their entire history, from the Spanish Exodus to this moment, had been funneled to this point by this man in a clean coat. Isaac's eyes met no one's. He hauled himself up into the darkness. Inside, the world collapsed into a sensory hell. The darkness was not complete. Slivers of gray light cut through gaps in the warped wooden walls, and the single, small, barbed wire wired opening high up. It was enough to see the outlines of 50, 60, 70 people already pressed together, standing, because there was no room to sit. The air was already foul, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale breath, and the sharp tang of urine from a corner where someone had already succumbed. The floor was littered with filthy straw. They found a space against a wall, sliding down into a perversion of sitting, their legs tangled with strangers. Samuel was crushed between Isaac and Esther. Leah sat facing the wall, her forehead pressed against the cold, splintered wood. The noise was a solid thing. Weeping, prayers in Ladino and Hebrew, the ragged breathing of the sick, the desperate calls of people trying to locate family members in adjacent cars, their voices muffled by the thick planks. Then came the sound of the doors, a long, shrieking, metallic groan from down the line as the heavy sliding doors were slammed shut, one after another, a wave of finality moving toward them. Their turn came. The rectangle of gray daylight narrowed as the door was heaved shut from the outside. The last thing Isaac saw was the face of a Greek guard, young, his eyes wide with something that might have been horror, looking directly at him for a split second before the world went dark. Then, the definitive deafening clang of an iron bar being dropped into place outside, locking them in. The sound echoed in the sealed metal box, a physical blow. Silence fell, heavier than the darkness. The weeping hitched. The prayers stopped mid-word. In that silence they all heard it. The heavy, rhythmic clump, clump, clump of a German soldier's boots walking the length of the car, testing the lock. The sound passed them by and faded. Minutes stretched into an eternity. People shifted, moaned. A baby began to wail, the sound piercing and hopeless. Then a jolt. A deep, metallic shudder ran through the frame of the car, followed by the deafening, screeching complaint of iron wheels against iron tracks. Another jolt, harder. The train lurched violently, throwing them against each other. And then, slowly, with a monstrous, inevitable inertia, it began to move. The darkness was now absolute, punctuated only by the thin, strobing strips of light from the cracks, flashing across frozen, expressionless faces. The sound was the roar of the wheels, a relentless, monotonous thunder that vibrated up through the floor into their bones, drowning out all human sound. They were a sealed capsule of despair, hurtling through a landscape they could not see. Esther pulled Samuel closer, wrapping her shawl around his head, as if to protect him, not from the cold, but from the reality of the noise, the smell, the moving darkness. Isaac put his arm around them both, his hand finding Leah's shoulder. She did not react. She was gone, lost somewhere behind her eyes. The train picked up speed, settling into a rhythmic, pounding cadence. In that roaring dark, time dissolved. There was no past, no future. There was only the present of the shaking floor, the suffocating air, the press of dying strangers, and the relentless, forward momentum of the iron river, carrying them away from the sea, from the sunlight, from the memory of a city that had already forgotten them, straight into the waiting, hungry heart of the night. Time ceased to have meaning inside the roaring, vibrating darkness of the cattle car. It was measured only in the gradual, terrible depletion of humanity. The slivers of light that cut through the walls shifted from gray to gray again, marking days they could not count. The air thickened into a viscous, toxic soup. The stench of vomit, excrement, and the sour smell of fear became a tangible layer on their tongues, in their lungs. The single barred opening was a cruel joke, offering no air, only a glimpse of a blurring, indifferent world. People began to die, not with drama, but with a quiet, horrible simplicity. An old man seated near the Cohens simply stopped breathing, his head lolling onto his neighbor's shoulder. His body, in the impossible crush, remained upright, held by the press of the living. A woman's wails for water faded into a weak mewling, then into silence. There was no space to collapse. Death here was not an event. It was a change in state, from a struggling organism to inert weight. Isaac, Esther, Leah, and Samuel existed in a feverish, dehydrated haze. Samuel stopped crying. He simply stared into the darkness, his body trembling with the constant vibration of the train. Leah retreated so far inward she seemed catatonic, her eyes open but unseeing. Esther used the last of her strength to whisper fragments of Ladino lullabies into Samuel's hair, her voice a dry rasp against the thunder of the wheels. Then the train began to slow. The change in momentum was a shock after the days of relentless speed. It jerked, shuddered, the wheels screeching in protest. A new collective tension electrified the car. This was not a stop on a journey. This was an arrival. The train crawled, then halted with a final jarring clang of couplings. An unnatural, deafening silence fell, broken only by the hiss of steam and the distant sound of shouted commands in German. From outside came the sounds of methodical, organized industry, boots on gravel, the barking of dogs, the rolling of heavy doors on other cars. Then, their own door. The iron bar clanged free. With a shriek of rusted metal, the heavy door was heaved open, sliding back to reveal a blinding, painful rectangle of daylight. The light was merciless. It stabbed into the dark, revealing the full, grotesque horror of the interior. The pale, emaciated faces squinting in agony, the dead still standing among the living, the filth, the utter degradation. Silhouetted against the light were figures in uniforms. SS men with polished insignia, their faces bored, impatient. "Raus! Schnell! Alles raus!" The commands were barks, devoid of humanity. They were driven from the car with clubs, stumbling out into the cold air that burned their lungs. The scene outside was a vast, geometric hell. Endless parallel tracks, each holding its own train, each disgorging its cargo of the damned. A low brown fog hung in the air, carrying a sweet, cloying, and metallic stench that was unlike anything they had ever smelled. In the distance, beyond wire fences, rows of bleak barracks stretched to the horizon, and dominating everything, visible between the rows of structures, were massive brick chimneys from which poured a thick, black, rolling smoke that blotted out the sun. They were on a ramp, a concourse of concrete between the tracks, swarming with thousands of disoriented people, guards, and a unique, chilling presence. Groups of skeletal figures in striped prison uniforms, their heads shaved, their eyes hollow, who moved with a grim, practiced efficiency, directing the new arrivals, clearing luggage from the cars. These walking ghosts were the first incomprehensible vision of their future. The Cohens clung to each other, their legs buckling after days of immobility. They were swept into a moving river of people being funneled off the ramp. And then they saw him. An SS officer, standing on a small platform, immaculate in his uniform, a baton in his gloved hand. His eyes, cold and assessing, flickered over the approaching line. To his left a gesture, to his right another. This was the selection. With a terrifying casual grace, he was dividing the living from the dead, the useful from the useless. The strong men, a few women, were directed to one side with a flick of the baton. The old, the very young, mothers with small children, the visibly weak or ill, were sent to the other. No words were exchanged, only the swift, irrevocable calculus of a glance. Isaac saw it happen ahead of them. A family like theirs, torn apart in an instant. He understood. His hand tightened on Samuel's shoulder. He looked at Esther. In her eyes he saw not fear, but a final devastating clarity. She knew. She bent and kissed Samuel's filthy hair. A long, breathless kiss. Her eyes closed, memorizing the feel of him. She looked at Leah, touched her daughter's cheek, pulling her back from her catatonia for a single, painful second of recognition. They were next. The officer's gaze swept over them. It passed over Isaac, lingered for a millisecond on his worn but still solid frame. The baton twitched left. A guard grabbed Isaac's arm, pulling him out of the line. Isaac resisted, turning back. The officer's eyes now fell on Esther, holding Samuel's hand, on Leah's vacant, beautiful face. The baton flicked, almost negligently, to the right. Isaac's world exploded into silent white noise. He saw a guard pulling Esther and the children away, their figures receding into the crowd, flowing in the opposite direction. Esther turned her head, her eyes finding his. She did not scream. She did not reach out. She simply held his gaze, pouring into that look a lifetime of love, of shared mornings and quiet evenings, of a world that was gone. It lasted a second. Then the human tide swallowed them. Samuel's small, bewildered face was the last thing Isaac saw before they vanished into the sea of striped uniforms and gray smoke. Isaac stood frozen, the guard's grip on his arm the only thing anchoring him to the earth. He was shoved forward into a line of shuffling men. He did not look back again. He could not. The man who had been Isaac Cohen, husband, father, merchant of Thessaloniki, was gone. What remained was a pair of eyes, staring ahead at the bleak barracks, seeing nothing but the after-image of his wife's final, silent goodbye, and the distant, endless columns of black smoke rising against the Polish sky, carrying with them the last breath of the ancient, Sephardic Jerusalem of the Balkans. The train had reached its destination. The machine had completed its function. All that was left was the burning.